Hi everybody and welcome to AP Macroeconomics with Mr. Farmer. Today we're talking about the business cycle and unemployment rates and different types of unemployment. So first off, what are we talking about? What is the business cycle? What are the areas that are most affected by the business cycle? Unemployment, the different types. A thing called the natural rate of unemployment, and then finally potential GDP, or potential real GDP rather. So there's four different sections of the business cycle: the peak, recession, trough, and then expansion. So the peak is just going to be the highest point, the largest amount of business activity is reached. It's going to be a temporary thing, and the business cycle is always hindsight. You realize you were at the peak once you're kind of done with it though. A recession, the specific is a period of decline in total output, income, and employment for 6 months consecutive. The idea of like a Great Depression is just a title, like World War One, World War Two. They were wars, but the titles came from the actual thing itself. So we have a recession, so 6 months downturn. Otherwise, if it's anything less than that, it would be a downturn in the economy. The trough is just the bottomed out section. It's going to be the end of that. And then finally, the expansion, the part that you really hope for, because it's going to follow the recession. It's the end of that, and you're going to have an increase in real GDP, income, and then employment is going to be rising once again. So if you draw, it's going to look like this, kind of a little S curve on here. So you have the peak, recession, expansion, peak, recession, expansion. And I know the worry sometimes is this thing called a double dip recession. That's the deal where you have this peak recession, you kind of plateau there, kind of bottom out there, go up a little bit, and then you dip down again. So that would be the double dip. So it's not just one big long one. You kind of have a little halting, and then you go down once again. So it's a really scary thing that's been talked about the last couple of years. But overall, you want this typical growth trend going upwards. And what we're going to find is if you look at the historical numbers, about every 7 to 15 years, you go through the business cycle. Not because of anything particular, just it's how it has kind of ebbs and flows as we go along. And so you can see here's the United States. All these blue columns are going to be recessions. This is an investment by percent. So you can see when investment starts to dip down, that's typically when recessions are happening. You can kind of see that happens here is 1970s with the oil crisis, 1980 and over here early 90s. Okay, and then we have the expansion there, big expansion up to 2000. We have the dot-com bubble, and then we have the Great Recession is what this 2008 one is called. And then unemployment rates, you can see, definitely tend to increase during recessionary times as well. So you can really see the business cycle in here, and you can look at the numbers. Here's a 5-year gap, 3-year gap. Here's a bigger one, about 10 years. And so you can see it really is about that much. So who is affected, or what areas are affected in the economy? So durable goods, people can and companies can make do. Durable goods are goods that last longer, last 2 years or longer. And so if you're in a recession, hey, just make it work, patch it together, repair the machine. And so typically industries that are on the durable side are more affected by the business cycle, because during times of expansion, hey, let's buy the new product, the new machine. During recession, we're not going to keep going through it, and so it can have this big drop off. Whereas durable goods, they're more insulated from it, because you know what? You still need the bread and the butter and the whatever else for your meals, even during recessions. Now you might buy one of those inferior goods. By inferior, I'm talking about the elasticity concept. Instead of buying the organic blah 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 whatever vegetable, you buy canned, but you're still buying the food. So non-durable industries are usually more insulated away from the business cycle. So unemployment. The unemployment rate is the number of people unemployed divided by the labor force times 100. So that's the equation. That is what we'll be using. That's a pretty standard one. So who is in the labor force? Well, one, in the United States, you're 16 years or older. It should be said it is the civilian labor force. So you must be a civilian, and you need to be either currently employed, you need to be looking for a job, or you can be part-time working. So you need to meet all of these requirements to be part of the labor force. So who is not? Well, if you're not a free civilian, so if you're institutionalized in some way, you're not part of that labor force. So even if you work, if you're in prison, you're not part of that. Military personnel, because it's civilian. And then if you're not looking for a job, this is where you might hear a thing called discouraged workers. Discouraged workers are a group of workers that have stopped looking for a job. And the moment they stop looking, they no longer are part of the labor force. And that can change unemployment rate numbers. And so that's something we'll be looking at a little bit later on. So for practice, I pulled up some numbers. So the number of people unemployed in 2008 was 8,924. The total labor force was 145,362. You notice the labor force in 2009, during the Great Recession, actually went down. This would be the discouraged workers because 6,000 less people were working. Despite that, the number of people unemployed increased quite a bit, and yes, this was a recession, as you can see, because when you plug into those numbers, unemployment rate went quite a bit up. So what did you notice from 2008 to 2009? Well, the number of people unemployed increased. That's a recession. The labor force decreased. Discouraged workers, people stopped looking, or early retirement could be also the potential. So again, this is why it's important to know what the definitions are when you're looking at these different things. So how about part-time workers? According to our textbook in 2005, there's 28 million part-time workers. 4.4 of those would have said that they wanted to work more than a full time. So some people say that they're underemployed because they want to work more than they currently are. And so that's another level we can talk about. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they do receive criticism for doing this. However, we'll talk later, there is a section of unemployment. There's 6 different types that do talk about this, but the main one doesn't reference part-time workers. You can look at, is this misrepresentative? Is the fact that people want to work more but aren't currently, should that be recognized as something else? The unemployment rate that is typically talked about doesn't represent these part-time workers that are underemployed. So different types of unemployment. And what we're talking about here is, why are people unemployed? Okay, well, there's a couple different reasons. One is a thing called frictional unemployment. This is where you're simply in between jobs. You have a desirable skill set. You are looking for a job. Some people might call this short-term unemployment. That would be the more official one if you're looking up in the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And usually this is anywhere from very few days to probably about a month and a half. There is a set number. I don't remember off the top of my head, though. The second is structural, and this is the really dangerous one because structural unemployment means the structure of the economy no longer needs your skill sets. And so that is the difficult one because structural unemployment is something that those jobs don't come back. Even during expansionary time periods, the economists figured out you aren't needed for whatever reason. Cyclical unemployment is the idea that somebody loses their position, their job, because of the business cycle, not because their skills are undesired, not because they simply want to look for a better job, but it's just a downturn in the economy. And the hope is that once the economy goes back up during their expansion time, their jobs will come back. And the last one is seasonal. Now, most of the time when you look up unemployment rates, it does say seasonally adjusted. And the idea is that people in this seasonally unemployment rate, they are voluntarily unemployed. For instance, agricultural farmers, they are working during the harvesting time, during the sowing time, everything else. But then they might not work during times when it isn't appropriate. They still have a full year income, a full-time income. They just don't work the entire time. So that's why it's seasonally adjusted is the concept here. So there's a thing called natural rate of unemployment, which is what we're going to call full employment. Full employment or natural unemployment is the amount of people that will be unemployed if you did not include the cyclical unemployment. Okay, because that means that you're just at the even keel, you're not in expansion, you're not a recession, you're just at the typical. There's going to be some amount of people that are frictionally unemployed because they want to change jobs. There's a certain amount of the group of people that their skill sets need to be changed. They're not employed, and then we usually seasonally adjust for the seasonal unemployment rates. So natural rate of unemployment is structural plus frictional plus seasonal, whatever that number is the natural rate of unemployment where it would typically be. And so what we can do is we can figure out what the potential output is. Okay, so the real GDP, the potential output is the real GDP if we were at the natural rate of unemployment. So we have a thing called unemployment rate and participation rate. So these are a couple different numbers. So unemployment rate is the number of those unemployed over the labor force, just what we're talking about. Participation rate, and this is just for academic interest. Now for our class, we'll use unemployment rate. The participation rate is the number of people in the labor force over the total population of eligible workers. It tells us something slightly different, and it acknowledges the discouraged workers concept, and so it is used in different places. So again, the labor force is those who are currently working or seeking a job, employment, over the total population of eligible workers, which is those who are working or not actively working but are in the working age. So for the United States, that would be 16 to 65. So for participation rate, if the total working age of the population is 100 people and 95 of them are currently working and 5 of them are looking for work, so 95 are working, 5 are looking for a job, then the labor force is everybody. Labor force is 100. Total population is 100. So we have 100% everybody that could be working is having a job or looking for a job. Now, if 3 of the currently unemployed workers become discouraged, they stop actively looking for a job, then 95 employed, but the active labor force is 97. So there's actually a decreased amount of people who are active in the economy. So let's look at that a little bit differently. So if the total population is 100 and originally 95 of them are working and 5% are not, then we had an unemployment rate of 5%. But what if you had those discouraged workers? If those 3 discouraged workers came from those who are unemployed, then the labor force is now going to be 97 people. 95% looking, 2% or 95 of them looking, having a job, 2 of them looking for a job, and 3 of them don't count. So in that place, the unemployment rate has actually gone down to 2%. So this is why it's important to look at that, because in this case, the participation rate tells us a different story. Originally, we had a 100% participation rate, but then when we had those 3 discouraged workers, they are represented. We now have a 97% participation rate. Not everybody is participating. So again, these different numbers tell us different things. The unemployment rate actually went down with those discouraged workers. We still have the same number of people working, just some people didn't choose to keep active. Whereas the participation rate kind of tells us more about what's going on. So even though they both discuss the same information, they do tell slightly different information stories. Now, there's actually 6 different kinds of unemployment rate. The one that we typically talk about is unemployment 3. Some of them do talk about discouraged workers, like unemployment 4, unemployment 5. Some of them talk about which ones are marginally attached to labor force. So there are different ones if you want to look into it. The typical reported one is the unemployment 3, though. You can see it's the official unemployment rate there. So going back to that potential GDP and talking about that natural rate of unemployment, we look at this. So this is for academic purposes. We're not going to use these equations, but the question comes up, how do you actually calculate the potential GDP? Potential real GDP. It's a natural rate of unemployment or employment divided by the actual rate of employment times the actual real GDP. The other way to do this is the 1 minus natural rate of unemployment divided by the 1 minus actual rate of unemployment times that. It's the same thing. So you can do this number if you want. We won't be using this, but again, that question pops up, so I thought I'd talk about it. So what's the impact? Why do we care about this thing? The real GDP shows us what could the economy be producing, and then we can use that as a barometer to say, where are we actually at? So again, the potential GDP is the real GDP at that natural rate of unemployment, meaning at full employment. And again, full employment is the same as the natural rate of unemployment, or NRU. And so here we have a graph from, you can see 95 to 2015. The blue is the potential real GDP. You can see it's a little more of a straight curve, whereas the red is the actual real GDP, and you can see the business cycle. Here's an expansion, recession. Here's the dot-com bubble right there. Here's the housing bubble, and then we have the 2007 recession, and then the expansion going on beyond this. And so we have this gap, which is the actual GDP. In this case, that would be the red, minus the potential real GDP, which would be the blue. So you might want to copy this down or take a screenshot of this. So the GDP gap is the actual minus potential. And so what does this tell us? Well, typically if you get a positive real GDP gap, that would be the actual is greater than potential. That means you're probably at a peak or an expansion. Unemployment is probably low, and inflation is typically thought to be higher. The negative is when the actual is less than potential. And so you're probably in a recession or a trough. Again, it needs to be 6 months or longer. So we're just going to use generic recession when we talk about these things and not worry about the technical. Unemployment rate is on the higher side of things, and inflation is traditionally seen as being lower. More conversation about that later on. So again, we were talking about the business cycle, what is most affected, durable or non-durable goods, what is unemployment, the 4 different kinds, the nature of unemployment, and the potential GDP. Hope that helped. Until next time.